Kun Lu has asked me to actually sit for him in terms of providing some introductory words about the group and the initiative as we will be talking about today in the context of TPP or Trade Policy Preview initiatives. So the Friends of Multilateralism Group was established in 2016 in Geneva, and it is a think tank of independent experts who are firmly committed to promoting multilateralism and shared growth within the multilateral trading system. And the members of the group mainly come from the ranks of the former senior trade diplomats, former senior staff of international organizations, and renowned scholars. The group actually supports efforts of the members of the WTO, the delegations in Geneva and in the capital, the officials in the capitals, to engage on WTO reforms and other issues of importance to the multilateral trading system, and help them restore the centrality of the WTO for the governance of trade and investment globally. And so we strive to provide high quality, independent and expert advice. And in that context, we organize different type of activities, including also providing some written papers and commentaries. So the group is managed by the board, and that board consists of Alejandro Jara. He is co-chair of the board, and Patrick Law as well, co-chair of the board, and as I said, the chief executive officer Xian Kulu, and also the other members of the board are Mr. Stuart Harbison and Daniel Crosby and myself. So I'm not going to name all the members of the group. We also do have the Friends of the Multilateralism Group, and we are very happy that we are able to meet very regularly, and as the ministerial conference actually nears, even more frequently than what normally we are able to do. So let me now move to my moderating role in terms of this session. This is the second one of the new series of new initiatives that is called Trade Policy Previews. By hosting these brainstorming sessions, we are actually hoping to provide a forum for very candid, very forward-looking dialogues. And the objectives of these are really to inform about the trade policy trends in our the key members of the WTO, key players of the WTO, and then also to be able to freely discuss the implications of those trends, and as well to promote mutual understanding through this meaningful dialogue. We plan to organize these sessions according to the planned reviews in the WTO. And so far we had one session on China, and as the Russian TPR is coming up, I think in November, unless I'm mistaken, we thought it is the right time to organize the one on Russia. And I think the last review that Russia had was in 2016. So we have invited a group of, extremely high-level speakers and experts on the topic on Russia. And let me just say that the short bio sketches of all three of them were shared with the invitation, but I would fail my moderating duty if I didn't just say a few words about each one of them. I think Mr. Maxim, Yurievich Medvedkov was invited as the first speaker. I hope he has managed to join us. Of course, he is currently a counselor at Moscow-based Center on WTO and a professor at the University of the Higher School of Economics, but he was, of course, instrumental as the chief negotiator for Russian accession to the WTO, and has done many of the duties with respect to the Chinese to the Russian activities in the WTO. The second speaker that we have today is Mr. Johan Vanderplaetse. He is the chairman of the board of the Association of the European Businesses and the senior vice president for Russia and CIS of the Schneider Electric. He has a double degrees in law, Faculty of Law of the University of Ghent and of European College in Bruges, and of course has again a huge record of very high level positions. Before the Schneider Electric, he was with the Emerson Process Management as vice president, and also before that with Alcatel. And then as a discussant, we have Dr. Péter Balás, who again shares both the academic and the diplomatic sort of curriculum here. He is currently involved as an expert on trade policy, WTO issues, and the broader aspects of international economic relations. But I think he has groomed his involvement in trade issues from the GATT days, and then also was very much involved in the European Commission. So we couldn't have actually enlisted a stronger team of experts to talk to us about the topic, and I think I think it's better if I leave the mic to them, so that we can hear from them on what are we going to expect in terms of the trade policy review of Russian Federation. So I just need to check whether Mr. Medvedkov has logged on, and whether we will start with him. And I think he's just entering the room. So let us see whether he will be able to immediately jump in, or Johan, I will otherwise rely on you starting. Mr. Medvedkov, Maxim? Okay, I think Johan, may I ask you then first start, and then we'll turn to Mr. Medvedkov after you.
Of course,
yeah, please go on.
Yeah, okay, so thank you so much. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, wherever you're located. Yes, as Mia introduced, besides my real job, Schneider Electric, I'm chairman of the Association of European Business, which is the largest foreign business association representing the interests of over 500 European, but not only European companies in Russia, ranging from the large ones to medium, small-sized companies. The AEB, as we call it, we have always been a vocal supporter of multilateral trade and the WTO. We strongly supported the WTO accession of Russia back in 2012, because indeed, per definition, we're believing that is the drive for growth, contributing to job creation, innovation. So obviously, it speaks for itself. And I think it's good to remind that because now that we are entering in a post-COVID-19 economical stimuli measures, whatever governments are considering, let's hope that this is not going to impact multilateral trade as well. When we started to see the accession, however, the expectations of the European business on the results or the benefits of the accession of Russia to the WTO were higher than indeed actually afterwards, reflecting today what it has brought to them. Back right before the accession, we did a survey amongst our member companies, and then at that time 75% of the respondents believed that after accession to the WTO, the Russian economy would accelerate its growth, and 60% believe that this would also benefit their own companies. And it's true that the membership of Russia to the WTO led to a significant reduction in import tariffs from more than 11.7% before accession to a decline to around 6%. But when we did a survey a couple of years ago, we felt that 70% of our member companies said it did not really impact our activity in Russia as much as we thought it would. So expectations were higher than WTO accession brought to the members. And we asked the question, okay, why is that? What happened? We believe that since its accession to the WTO, Russia's trade policy has been led by or through three significant changes, which impacted business as well, European business or global business. A good one and two changes which are more difficult. I think the good change that we have seen is after the accession, there was the formation of the EAEU, the Eurasian Economical Union. That was indeed an accelerator of reform and ease of doing business for our companies. But the other evolutions that we have seen since then were the so-called sanctions against Russia, which have been leading to a subsequent development of all kind of import substitution measures by the Russian government. And those three changes, they impacted the reality post 2012. Maybe first on the EAEU, which is this trade union between Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, loosely based on the EU with the four freedoms of goods, persons, capital, and services. A lot of progress has been made, and people often are saying it is an imperfect free trade association. It is indeed imperfect. But if you look at how many decades it took the EU to be where it is today, I think in a rather short period of time, the EAU actually brought or did bring a lot of positive achievements as well. And it became a reality for companies doing this business in this part of the world. It's a reality that we are welcoming because it makes business easier. What I mean is that, for instance, there is no only one custom border. Many harmonizations have taken place. It is easy to ship your goods, your services within the Free Trade Association. It's bringing benefits as well for the smaller members of the EAEU. Like in the case of Armenia, it's allowing without having to open a dedicated large operation in Armenia to service your customers there via Russia, for instance, or Kyrgyzstan via Kazakhstan. So it's making our life easier. And when we are interacting as the AEB with the European Commission, we see that there is no real conversation, also maybe some technical conversation between the EU and the EAEU taking place. We always make the case that we need to step up here and to further work on harmonization of certification of rules, because it's only a win-win situation. That is the good change since 2012. The two other ones are more difficult. Change number 2 that we have seen is, of course, the started in 2014 with the Ukrainian crisis and then the related sanctions. No, I mean, I don't want to make a political decision here on what happened from that angle, but I would like to focus on the consequences of what happened. And what we have seen is that the crisis in the Ukraine and the related sanctions and countermeasures, counter sanctions by Russia, they kind of hijacked the positive effects that WTO accession could have brought, and they have clearly harmed trade between Russia and Europe, to pick that example. You know what the EU sanctions are, the US sanctions, which initially were very well coordinated. Business is, of course, compliant. We adjust to that new reality. But besides of the sanctions, there has always been this threat that more might follow. You know, constantly those announcements, and especially that part, more could follow, has created a large uncertainty in the business environment that is hampering investments, is leading to a lower economic growth. And if you look at the foreign direct investment that took place since 2014 in this part of the world, in Russia, I'm actually speaking out of Moscow now, clearly it is at very low levels today, partially because of that uncertainty that we have seen. And not wanting to be a politician, but at the AAB, we have always urged to get beyond that dialogue of sanctions, because we believe that as a policy tool, they are not effective. They are not changing what they were supposed to bring. And on the contrary, they have provoked a number of what we call unintended consequences and shifts in the supply chain that is going against the interest, actually, of our companies, both European companies, Russian companies. Why is that? Because of the change number 3 that we have seen since 2012, which is that afterwards Russia really embarked on a made in Russia or import substitution program. Now, that's as such not new. Since the early 90s, Russia always said we have to diversify our economy from being dependent on exports of hydrocarbons, which, by the way, is today even more urgent than ever before. But before 2014, the driver was mainly economically. We have seen that since 2014, after the imposition of the sanctions, the efforts increased tremendously, and it was more driven by a security consideration than by an economic consideration, especially when you look at the supplies to what is called critical infrastructure, electricity grids, telecommunication grids, oil wells, metals and mining. The risk that the Russian authorities feel of being dependent on imported equipment to support their critical infrastructure, knowing that at any given moment there might be new sanctions which are forbidding the supply of spare parts or support, really has led to the fact that they were pushing forward very hard on this import substitution policy. I was attending in the St. Petersburg Economical Forum, had a discussion with Deputy Minister Vasily Shpak, who clearly said security supersedes WTO, Tochka, point. I mean, that was a very clear statement from their side. So import substitution moved to another phase from moving preliminary investment problems to developing and transferring of new technological competences, and they're also focusing, by the way, on the creation of export-oriented industrial sectors. They're using tools like the so-called special investment contract tool, which about a year ago, July 2020, was amended, which is giving tax incentives and grants for those companies which are indeed localizing production of their equipment in Russia itself. And the good news, if you like, is that as such on the surface, those tools are not making any difference between a Russian manufacturer or a foreign manufacturer, provided the foreign manufacturer is also producing in Russia itself. So on the surface, it is equal, but there are more subtle differences between Russian players and foreign players here, like the fact that the new procedure is requiring extensive documentation and procedures that are restrictive for foreign SMEs, especially companies that don't have a lot of experience in the Russian market. Foreign experts are not allowed to the expert council, which is looking into further implementation rules. So the fact that we are not invited to those expert councils means that our voice is not heard. And sometimes we do see that the level playing field because of that is not equal, and I can go on that one. So while we are as a business community supporting a course towards a greater industrialization of the Russian economy, we are more and more concerned about the very stringent rules for being recognized as a Russian product, opaque scoring methodologies, selective approach on the formation of components that you need for your local manufacturing, and you name it. And very recently, August the 28th of this year, for instance, for medical devices, the authorities introduced the so-called two is a crowd rule, which basically means that for medical devices, it's sufficient to have one domestic manufacturer, that imports of medical devices are not allowed or not considered. That is already far away from measures to protect your critical infrastructure. And we see similar restrictions on the use of foreign software.
Tremendo. Aparte, le escondí una.
Yeah. Okay. And then also the discrimination against imports for public procurement. That's another thing that is high on our agenda. Discriminatory assessment of procurement bids, for instance, with a deduction of 15% of the price provided production takes place locally, requirements for prior authorizations, and I can go on. So that is a first thing that really had a bad impact on the benefits that we thought the WTO accession would bring. And then also, I would like to make the case that on top of that, there are some global dynamics which are amplifying it all. Geopolitics, I mean, I'm maybe a little bit exaggerating, but still, geopolitics are killing the global supply chain. The days when the technology is developed in, say, Silicon Valley, and from there it was sold across the world, or the days when the technology was developed in Shenzhen, China, and was sold from there across the world, those days to a certain extent are gone. And although it doesn't make any economical sense at all, we do see more and more at the senior ExCom level of large companies, a breakdown of the global supply chain in at least two blocks. Western technologies for the Western world, Eastern technologies for the rest of the world, if I can put it like that. And one of the big questions is, where is Russia, Central Asia aligned to? Yeah, of course, there are also subclusters to make it more complex, but it's a very important question. And the reason of that breakdown of the global supply chain, yes, indeed, the sanctions against Russia, the unintended consequences of what I just described, the counter-reaction of Russia for made in Russia. There's also what I call the quasi-sanctions. What are quasi-sanctions? Sanctions we know. We know we cannot supply certain technologies. We know that we cannot supply our goods on certain territories or to certain designated entities. All that is set in law. But there have been cases of our member companies which wanted to sell technology to their Russian counterpart. The Russian counterpart was not sanctioned. The technology is not sanctioned. They are getting a phone call from let me put it like that, from Washington, saying that, dear company, we know that you're on the brink of selling that technology to a Russian company X. if you do that, we cannot forbid it, but we will no longer be able to sell that technology to the US domestic market. US domestic market for many multinational companies is still a bigger market than the Russian market. So that kind of, I'm using now a heavy term, but kind of economical blackmail, if I may, is also playing a role in what global executive committees of large companies are seeing. But it was until recently a Russia mainly problem that those companies were having, until another big change occurred, which you could basically say crystallized around the famous Huawei case, whereby that Chinese company is blocked to sell technologies to European operators, to EU operators. The reasons there again are very, very complex. And I think it is true that there were legitimate concerns about certain Chinese business practices, but including around the protection of IPRs. But our view is that if there are concerns, they ought to be resolved through mechanisms like indeed the WTO, but not by bluntly forbidding the supply of technology components to Chinese companies. Because this has then again had an amplifying impact on the reasoning of many companies. All of a sudden, the problem is no longer a Russian problem. All of a sudden, they see similar kind of concerns growing about supplying technologies to China. I used to work, as Mia was saying in the introduction, for a French company, Alcatel. Doesn't exist anymore. It has been swallowed up by Nokia. But I do remember that for Alcatel, China used to be the largest market globally. Russia was a huge market. Today, Nokia is selling nothing almost anymore to the Chinese market, to the Russian market, because of the fact that, okay, the Chinese are reasoning, if my company Huawei cannot sell to Europe, why should the European company be able to or be allowed to win tenders in China? So what I'm trying to say here is that not all people, in my view, are appreciating the scope of the geopolitical changes that are taking place and that are having an impact on business streams. And it is a fact that quite some global companies, because of all of that, are, as I said, looking into a breakdown of the supply chain, different technologies produced in Europe, United States, for that part of the world, different technologies which are produced in Asia, China, with a minimization of US content, the de minimis rule that you all know, for them to be able to stay global players. Otherwise, they might not be able to continue to stay global players. And I think indeed this is something which is accelerating. Back to Russia. Russia is also observing this. I was mentioning the Russia for Russia program, but I'm also seeing that for those kind of technologies where it is impossible for Russian companies to come up with a equivalent because of the fact it's too complex, or the Russian market is not big enough, they are looking as a second best option sourcing from China to the Russian market. Pick the example of 5G. All the Russia first of all was pushing very hard for the development of an own 5G technology. It's very complex. The second best option is indeed to buy equipment from Huawei, because there again, at least they know that their telecom grids might be bugged. It could be bugged, absolutely. But at least there's no threat that China is going to impose sanctions of spare parts and upgrades to Russian telecom grids, which are based on 5G. So this is a calculation that we see is also taking place. And if I look at the statement that the CEO of Ericsson was making not so long ago, he was already looking ahead of the curve, looking to the next generation, 6G, saying it is not excluded that China is going to develop a completely different 6G standard than the Western standard. And if this is true, then also from an IT point of view and all the supporting technologies, you will see an acceleration of the supply chain breaking down even quicker in those two parts. Now, let me start maybe, or no, let me end. I'm looking at the time. Let me end at maybe a positive note. Is it all bad? should we normalize the relations? I mean, I'm making the case here, I understand, to a strengthening of WTO as a mean to resolve disputes rather to go the way of unilateral sanctions. There are global challenges that don't know any borders anyway. I mean, the pandemic has been a very recent example, but there is the other challenge as well on climate change. Very happy that October the 24th, Frans Timmermans is going to visit Moscow for high-level talks, because there again, unless we are collaborating, it will be impossible to address that global challenge. I was scheduled to speak last Friday, remember, but we had instead a meeting with Sergei Lavrov, who also made the case of collaboration around those kind of topics, at least is a good starting point, which we need to do. Although, again, also there he made, of course, the side comment about the concerns Russia has around the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the carbon tax, which in the eyes of Russia is more looked as a hidden protectionist measure, which it is not in my view. But there again, the case very clearly that Minister Lavrov was saying whatever kind of carbon tax is to be introduced, let it be in full compliance with the rules of WTO as well. And then indeed we can really start about collaboration. So I would like to leave it here and pass the word on the next pair, but that's basically the pitch I wanted to give. As the AAB, we're strong believers in the WTO. We regret that certain events took place since 2012. We believe that not everybody necessarily appreciates the consequences on the supply chain of what has been happening. And we would like to re-emphasize the case for stronger multilateralism and collaboration via the WTO. Mia?
Thank you very much, Johan, for this comprehensive, actually, review. And I think you have come up with a number of issues that will be of interest to discuss later, because they very well may come up also among the questions of the members to Russia in the process of the review. But let us move on now to Mr. Maxim Medvedkov. I have introduced you already, and apologies, Maxim, that we have had to reverse the order of speakers. We just didn't want to waste any time, but I hope you understand, and we are very glad that you can join us now.
Yes, good afternoon, dear colleagues, and I'm really sorry for a short delay. It's because of power interruption. I'm trying new solar technologies, not working still well at my place. If you allow me, first of all, I would like to thank you for your kind invitation to join this meeting today. And I will split my short presentation in two parts. One part, what's good or bad we received from the WTO, and second, what could be Russia's position in future developments in the organization. I will start with the first one, and I fully appreciate the view which Johan has shared with us, that businesses were satisfied with the results of accession, but they expected more. I think I feel very similar. My view is very similar to that. We received a lot of pluses. For example, we received universal trading rules instead of 126 trade agreements with different countries. We operate with one. It's much more easier and much more effective. We clearly have no alternative, so we have conducted a kind of a stress test. What will happen with Russia's trade policy if WTO will disappear for whatever reason? And we realize that we will have a big troubles to operate without that rules. we really efficiently implemented some of the commitments which we took in favor of our economic development. I will give you an example of transparency. Transparency, which was negotiated in terms of in our accession, are very big commitments in terms of what we promised to members to do and to promise to ourselves. They are going more than Article 10 or other provisions of GATT or GATS instruct us to do, and we are extremely happy to be transparent, both from the terms of view of economy, because now everybody is participating in drafting of legal acts for the future, everybody who wants. But also secondly, in personal terms, transparency have given to us much more information about what's happening around. Give you an example, last year, our team proposed in one of bilateral negotiations in the WTO to take part of our accession transparency commitments, and the members refused. They've said that we are going too far with that transparency. My second example is agriculture. Our figures before we started negotiations were very negative. We have spent about 100 billion US per year to support agriculture, and we spent approximately the same sum to cover imports, and at that point our agriculture was absolutely inefficient. In accession, we agreed on a different IMS sum, about 4.5 billion per year. We are spending, in fact, half of it, and our agriculture is the most dynamic sector in Russia's economy in terms of exports and in terms of also domestic production. So the lessons from WTO accession in agriculture were extremely successful for our regulators and also for our businesses. And finally, and I will support Johan, Eurasian Economic Union. Eurasian Economic Union was started in 2009 when all members, at that time there were 3 members, Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan, were acceding to WTO. That's why all our experts were forced to draft legislation of customs union in a full compliance with the rules. The result is that we have now a queue from 40 countries which are willing to conclude a preferential trade agreement and with the union. And they are saying to us that in terms of your predictability, in terms of your legislation, you are rather attractive, and we would like to establish a long partnership. It's positive elements. We have others as well. What WTO has not done, but was expected and what was promised to us when we started accession. First, our partners, the members, have not implemented all their commitments toward Russia. Some of them continue to treat Russia in the same way they've treated Soviet Union products 40 years ago, like fertilizers, for example. It's a kind of a quasi non-market economy approach in anti-dumping. we face a huge countervailing and other duties because our enterprises buy part of its natural gas at regulated prices, and investigators saying to us that they believe it's too low, and they have to compensate. They treat it as a subsidy. And our explanations, look, it's not a subsidy, and if it's subsidy, it's fully in line with our WTO commitment of gas pricing, they are just ignored. Also, we continue to face restrictions in terms of market access in gas, despite decisions of a panel. Members continue to restrict sales of that gas, and look, we have observed last week, and we still observe the consequences of these restrictions, which may have a direct effect on EU consumers' wallets. It's about connection between our economy and WTO, where we have not received what we expected. Another worry is that WTO loses its functionality. We have no appellate body, and the cases which we have won at the first stage, at the panel stage, are suspended, and they are suspended for an indefinite period of time. Members have commitments to notify their economic policies, but if they don't do it, nothing happens. So there is no implementation of some of the commitments. Finally, it was always uneasy to complete trade negotiations, but now members have huge problems even to start them. It means that instead of trying to solve this or other strategic issue in WTO, people are looking around for other solutions, be it a preferential trade agreement or regional or something else. But WTO is not always lucrative for such kind of things. And finally, we feel increased influence of politics. Politics was always part of the GATT, always part of the WTO, but previously it was much less notable. If you develop a new passenger plane these days in Russia, and it's a real case, we develop a big passenger plane as a part of international cooperation project, but our supplier suddenly rejects to supply to us wings, and they refer to instructions of their foreign office. That's what Johan has told as well. So what have we to do? We have two options. We have an option to stop the project, which already has consumed billions of investments, or we have a possibility to develop our wings ourselves. And second option would be natural, but it is blamed. It's blamed also in WTO as an import substitution, but it's blamed by same people who has instructed to stop these supplies. Conclusion is that WTO cannot guarantee full stability of trade. And not only because rules are weak, but also barriers to their enforcement are more often supported by political involvements. On that basis, I think we may construct a possible position of Russia in future developments in the WTO. First, Russia participates in all trade negotiations on new rules, including full Buenos Aires package. And I think Russia will support completion of these tracks, which will contain tangible results. Commercial and systemic elements will play more or less proportional role in these considerations. Then on dispute settlement, Russia is one of the major users of WTO enforcement. Russia participates in 112 disputes, including 8 as compliant and 10 as respondent. So Russia has pocketed 3 panel decisions with important positive results for its economy. So it's interested to have again effective dispute settlement on board, including, of course, appellate body. Russia has made several proposals in respect of WTO reform, and some of them are connected with the concept of strengthening of rules and developing principle of competitive neutrality. In Russia, this understanding of that competitive neutrality issue is broader than normally is used in other, say, destinations, including in OECD. In Russia's view, this concept should cover all key elements of modern trade exchanges, like subsidies, like activity of transnational enterprises. They should include rules for trade in technologies for same reason as Johan has explained, that we have barriers in technological trade. And if these barriers will continue to exist and will continue to grow, you have a systemic problem in economic development in the world itself. It's not only about Russia and mainland Russia, it's about other countries, including developing countries. And another issue is from that concept or broad concept of competitive neutrality is connected with a framework for exemptions from the rules. This issue is of fundamental importance, and it seems Russia may have problems to accept broad policies of its trading partners, which will be based on exemptions. In particular, this is valid for environmental measures. Russia's experts' view is that if you have a deficit of rules in WTO, very probably you should develop additional rules covering this deficit. Exemptions should be logically treated as exemptions. Certainly protection of environment, it's not exemption in our life. It should be a rule in our life to protect environment. Respectively, we have, if needed, modify GET rules and GES rules in order to accommodate environmental concerns, but not to rely specifically on exemptions. Finally, I would like to touch one important issue, which is connected with the role of the government in trade. Russia is not limiting or promoting any type of ownership. I refer to our constitution. Under our constitution, discrimination between different types of ownership is prohibited, is just impossible. And in Russian view, the problem in trade arises not because of type of ownership, but because of unequal rights and possibilities. All companies in trade should be bound by same rules. As soon as it, or if it happens, the problem of SOE, Este, and other problems which are discussed currently in WTO will be solved. My overall conclusion, colleagues, is would be very short. If at some point the distinguished group of Friends of Multilateralism will open membership not only to individuals, but also for countries, I'm pretty sure Russia will request for qualification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxim, and thank you very much also for including the segment on the role of Russia in future in future building or strengthening of the WTO in terms of the reforms and rulemaking and everything else. I'm sure we will come back to that as well. But let us now hear from Dr. Balás. We would ask you to comment on the speakers' presentations in about 10 minutes so that we can have some time for questions from the floor. Dr. Balás, if I may see you on the camera. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. So nice to see if I may join the practice that I'm Peter, as you mentioned, Mia, that we call each other at first names. First of all, I am very glad, and I was happy when my old colleague and I think even friend Maxim has proposed for me to participate as discussant in this at this event. We have a long professional, if you want, common past, not just with him personally, but myself. I've been working on various types of Russian issues, both as Hungarian trade officials, but also official, and especially at the European Commission DG Trade for something like 30 years. Listening to the both statements, of course, there were a number of overlapping issues, but there were also differences. The 10 minutes are not enough to go into detailed explanations on analysis, so I will try to selectively react to perhaps the most important aspects, also drawing on my personal experiences in the past period. Let me start with Russia's WTO accession, which I think was a major success. And to be frank, it was made possible by three participants, the Russia itself, the US, and the EU. As we have been working together in during 2010-11 to negotiate, or rather to renegotiate, Russia's terms of accession due to the formation of the Eurasian Economic Union in between, and which implied changes. This was a very intensive work, but the results we all know. Russia has become a member formally in August 2012, and this led to where we are today, at least to the possibilities. I have, however, to add very frankly that I think that these initial years could be called as the high watermark of the relationship with Russia, because the developments since that time were uneven. I have been working also closely with the EIB, and although not at the time, Johan took over. And so it was clear that there were already from the start problems with the Russian trade policies, quite exceptionally already right after accession. The EU thought it necessary to start a WTO dispute case against Russia, and I'm sure that Max can recall it. This was linked at that time to economic problems, not fulfillment of certain tariff reductions and some other issues. Over time, at least when it comes to the tariffs, these problems have been sorted out and resolved. It looked like that perhaps we can enter a more successful period of the cooperation, and this was also supported by the strong Russian statements about the being attachment to multilateral to the multilateral system, to WTO disciplines. However, when we look at the what I would call invisible market access barriers, and here again, I think that we have heard from Johan very numerous examples, which according to the European business are used in Russia, then the picture is already not so positive. And these problems have multiplied, especially from and since 2014. I also want to avoid politics, but we have to admit that some very important changes took place and events linked to the crisis in Ukraine. And without going into details, I can just tell you that it was not, for instance, the West and certainly not the EU, which played an initiating role in this crisis. And certainly, especially the EU, for which Russia used to be number 3 trade partner and even number 2 in some years for imports, was extremely unhappy about the resulting loss of business opportunities and the resulting the consequences, the sanctions and counter sanctions which were referred to and which came clearly from the political and military actions that happened. Since that time, unfortunately, and this I say as an old-trained hand with regret, the politics and the business have become very much intertwined with all the negative consequences which both Maxim and Johan have referred to. But this is the situation where we are. I would just note that in spite of these negative changes, since there was a last attempt where we again worked together in 2014 and 15 to try at least to save as much as possible for the possibilities of a more smooth economic trade cooperation by spending some 2 years in a bilateral and later trilateral negotiations involving Russia, Ukraine, and the EU in order to allow the coexistence of the EU's association agreement, including a deep and comprehensive free trade area with the good economic cooperations with Russia. But these attempts were doomed, as it turned out, and I would say, sorry to say, the time was wasted, because in the end, it turned out that there was unfortunately no such intention. And when the mentioned EU-Ukraine agreement entered into force, Russia has immediately stopped all economic links with Ukraine, has basically suspended even their remaining CIS relationship, and this is where we are today. Plus, again, further sanctions and follow. All this is regrettable and would have been good to avoid, but now we have to live with the present situation. As having heard so much, probably not several of us, about the, I think Russian invented slogan of Lisbon to Vladivostok, which meant that to allow free trade relations between basically you're covering whole of Eurasia. This in reality, we are very far from it today. We do not have even the necessary trust and to have smooth WTO relations. I think that it is from at least from the knowing even the present policies and intentions of the EU, there is an interest to make this dream, which is now the dream today, into reality, and to allow that if you want, cooperative relations are restored, the causes for the mutual sanctions are stopped, and we go back to square one without politics in the economic relations, including in the WTO, and on that basis, subsequently building up necessary trust and necessary conditions for real free trade and to avoid the present import substitution policies. We heard Maxim's explanation why it was considered necessary. I accept some of it, but frankly, I cannot share that all this came due to the West, if you want, or due to the EU, that Russia was forced into a corner. So let's hope that at least on the midterm, better times will come, and we can again focus on the core political, on the core trade and economic issues, including improving also the conditions for mutual investments. Thanks.
Thank you, Péter, very much, and thank you for ending on the positive note. So we will now open the floor to questions, and what normally we ask people is to raise their hand or to simply just start speaking. If you cannot if you cannot raise your hand, or to signal somehow through the chat function that you have a question. So I'm trying to look at the screen, and I'm hoping Natalie will also help me to monitor the order in which the questions will appear. And of course, if you can, Alan, I see you on camera. Is that a signal that you would like to ask a question or comment?
Sure.
Yes, please go ahead.
First of all, thanks to our speakers for a very good elucidation of Russia's participation since its succession. I do have a question. Maxim in particular went over several areas where reform would be helpful to Russia. So I'd ask what our speakers know of Russia's priorities for reform. Clearly, carbon border adjustments will be a major issue, I would think, for Russia. So that area of new rules. But if what is Russia's current agenda? What should it be on reform?
Thank you, Alan. I think we can go directly to Maxim then, and then ask after that Johan and Péter if they have any comments as well. Maxim?
Yes, thank you. I have problems to answer, and I have problem to answer what would be the next stage of reform, because in my view, we have completed reforms. I'm participating in reforms in my country for more than 30 years. And I think we have made already the basics, the same basics as others did. And now what countries are doing, they are adjusting their policies, economic policies, other policies to environment, to new needs, to new targets. And I think that's exactly what Russia is doing and supposed to do. All major targets were already achieved before, and now we are on a path of say reaction to new challenges and respectively modify and implement the policy. For example, it's a good example on this carbon issue, environment issue. Yes, it's not new for us, but it's something which has accelerated domestic thinking and requested new policies. I don't know what these policies will be. We have different views in respect of what the European Union proposes, because we are victim number one in economic terms. If this happens, I mean, carbon adjustment mechanism as it is constructed will be in place. We will lose between 3 and 6 billion per year. It's a big sum of money. The question is what we may get in return, and how we may participate jointly in fighting carbon and developing stable climate. But I think again it's probably policies which and reforms which also other countries are doing or are preparing to do.
Okay. May I go back to Johan and Peter if they have an additional comment on this, on the priorities for the reform in the post-COVID recovery world?
Yeah, if I may, it's a very good question, Alan, and I would argue that there are quite some challenges. On the contrary, I mean, I would like on top of my head to pick 3 that I think are very important. First of all, no secret, the economical model of Russia to a large extent is still based on the export of hydrocarbons, with the world going green, with the EU investing massively in renewables, China doing the similar kind of actions. It is clear that not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow, the proceeds of exporting hydrocarbons are going to go down. Not tomorrow, because I mean, going too quick is posing other problems, let's be very clear. But I think indeed the economy has to get off from an addiction of being on this infuse of export of hydrocarbons. For the economical model, but also, by the way, Russia has its own climate challenges. Just 2 years ago, there was still a state of denial on many levels. Today, everybody realizes that climate change is hitting Russia particularly hard. Global warming goes twice as quick in the Arctic. A lot of infrastructure is based on permafrost, which is melting. So for many reasons, this has to be taken very seriously. Hence, diversification from the economy. Challenge number 2, I believe economy is still very much dependent on or concentrated in the hands of large state-owned companies. Some of them are very efficient. I mean, Sber is a good example of a very successful transformation of a dusty state bank into a global IT player, which is doing fantastic things. But quite some state-owned companies are far from being efficient and have a lot of things to do in improving corporate governance as well. So I would say that is another challenge. And mirroring that one, I think the country has to step up the support to develop a vibrant SME sector. in real innovative economies. Yes, you have big, large players. Pick the example of Germany, where you have the Volkswagens of this world. But the economy is really carried by thousands of large or medium-sized companies, the so-called Mittelstand, which are per definition very, very competitive, very, very innovative. And that's the thing that is still largely absent in the structure of the Russian economy. So that would be my answer. I can continue, but those three, I would say, are very, very important.
Peter, do you want to add anything to it?
I would just react to a single issue. This is the CBAM, the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. When Maxim mentioned that Russia is the #1 victim, I thought that he would also speak similarly to Johan about the climate impacts, because really what we know all what happens in the methane emissions in the Arctic, and for methane which has been trapped for possibly hundreds of thousands of years now suddenly into the atmosphere, with all the very rather tragic consequences all over the world, including in Russia, very hot summers, poor crop in some respect, and also in Europe. And these were also not just economic losses, but we know that in Europe, for instance, in Belgium, in Germany, there were such flash floods which killed hundreds of people. So this is no joke at all. The EU, but also other European countries, tried to raise this for years, but there was not this risks of climate change. There was not much interest, and I would say that the first opponent was the US under Donald Trump. Now with President Biden's entry into office, this situation has to a certain extent changed. The CBAM gives the possibility, and I don't want to go into detail, for other countries to introduce similar measures in order, like the EU has, in order to reduce the carbon emission of the production by taxing or by introducing even their own CBAM type measures, in which case this would be in the future system will be taken into account. But this is still at an initial phase. Nobody expects that the CBAM would start even partially to operate before 2024 at the earliest. So it gives sufficient time for Russia, but also for other countries of the world to work together and to think through how they could also develop such carbon policies which would allow to avoid the negative economic consequences. Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right, let me see if there are any hands for other questions. Or Alan, if you want to come back on this, if you are satisfied with the answers or not. Okay. Yes, please.
Okay. If no one else has a point at this.
Well, I don't see any hands, Alan. Yeah.
So one thing, a couple of things Maxim mentioned. Lack of notification, countries not living up to notifications, the appellate body situation where Russia, I believe, has perhaps also appealed into the void. I'm not sure, but that may be the case. The inability to start trade negotiations. So in terms of what the WTO should do from a Russian point of view to be more capable of dealing with current challenges, political influence, the geopolitical issues Maxim mentioned, the potential for looking for other fora if the WTO can't move forward. How should the WTO change? What is does Russia have specific expectations from MC12, for example, for a beginning?
I think that's an excellent question. Actually, I was also aiming to ask that towards the end, and I think it will be interesting also to combine that with one priority that I have not heard at all mentioned is development of services sectors and how that can help Russian economy actually in gaining efficiency and steering away from the resource based and heavy industry. So anyway, if we can go back to Maxim again to comment on the expectations from MC12 in the first place, Maxim.
Yeah, thank you. It's difficult to respond to this question because, look, I personally is always optimistic, but what I see in the press and what I hear from my colleagues and from our government, they are less optimistic, and basically I think would be a very good result if ministers in November will agree on a clear further plan of actions. So I personally do not expect, unfortunately, any big successes. Probably they will complete agreement on fisheries. Probably some progress will be fixed in other negotiations. But it would be local victories. And what we really need, we need predictability in the system that all countries say, we agree that we will do by that time something, by other time something, and it would be a kind of a stable path. Countries will be able to invest in without, of course, without guarantee, unfortunately, that it will lead to success, but at least when you have the path, you know what to do. But whether it will happen or not, I think it's a little bit early to predict. People are in preparations, and let's see.
Thank you, Maxim. I think it's a rather gloomy sort of prospect, right? When we are just almost a month and a half only away from the start of this, and we don't have much to hope for except for fisheries and maybe services, and the, in terms of joint initiative. So let me go back to the board and see if there are other challenging questions for our speakers. And I am looking at, everyone is very quiet today. It only means that the speakers have really explored all the possible sort of scenarios that people are thinking in terms of a key player in the WTO, like Russian Federation is, in the coming process of the trade policy review. So, okay, I'm not seeing anyone wanting to make any comments. I can go back to the speakers and ask them if they want to provide any last comment or statement, and afterwards then I can close the session. So maybe I can start with Péter. Peter, we can't hear you, Peter. We can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Now it works. So
Yes.
unfortunately, I have to agree with Max that the outlook for MC12 is rather poor. I also think, and as you also yourself mentioned, Mia, that there will be no meaningful decisions which beyond the two areas you mentioned. This is what I hear from my colleagues, and the maximum, if you want forward-looking outcome, could be really an agreed plan of action. Having been involved in GATT and then WTO issues, and seeing especially the differences between the GATT and post-Uruguay round dispute settlement, I would think that the most important would be to restore an operating dispute settlement system. Because if you might have the best rules, if those cannot be enforced and can be blocked by the defending party, as was the case in GATT times, then we don't have really a functioning WTO. Unfortunately, the outlook is not very bright. This is one area where the US remains still rather hesitant, let's put it that way, but I think that there are many, many other countries which hide behind the US. So I look forward with interest for whether this issue can be at all part of a forward-looking agenda. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. And Johan, do you have something to leave us with?
No, I mean, just first of all, my appreciation that a forum like FMG is existing, because indeed we speak often a lot about each other, but not necessarily enough to each other. And it's with this open type of exchange that really quite some misunderstandings can be taken out of the equation. And in the same spirit, thanks a lot that as a business association we are able as well to express our opinion, that you listen to our own voice, because at the end of the day we are directly impacted and affected in that respect. Trade is our thing. So no, I mean, again, thanks a lot, Mia, for having had me here, and looking forward to continue the dialogue.
Thank you very much, Johan. Anytime. I think we are committed to hear from all the stakeholders and the actors in the area of trade, and so definitely much welcome to come back and talk to all of us. And Maxim, before I close, let me give you the floor once again, if you want to add anything for the end.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for extremely interesting discussion. In 2 weeks, we will have a formal trade policy review of Russia. So our government already received a dozen of questions. Some of them are very similar to what we discussed today. We'll see what will come out from that exercise, but I would like to just to confirm that in my view, in view of many of my colleagues in Russia, WTO is something, some really good, efficient and unique instrument. And if by joint efforts we will be able to restore it, it will be beneficial for just for everybody. And the work of your group is certainly a very good contribution to that effect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxim. Certainly, I think through conversations like this one, and allowing for a frank sort of discussion on the issues that continue linger with respect to the trade policies of members, we certainly can ease hopefully the discussions in a more formal forums and hopefully get to some sort of solutions to that. I think it is very useful also for our members to hear from people, from experts like you three that have talked to us in terms of, you know, what is happening in particular key trading members, trading economies in the world, and how that is linked to the overall sort of possibilities or likelihoods of changing the whole system for the better. So we are really into increasing transparency and through these discussions, sort of removing the distances and understanding of the causes and consequences of the various decision making in the countries. So thank you very much for allowing us to benefit from your discussions tonight, and thank you, Alan, very much for your very pertinent questions that allowed us to go a little bit deeper into the thinking of Russian government in terms of positioning the economy in the region and in the global economy. So with this, I can only thank you all for participating, and hopefully we'll be announcing new events, and I hope you will be able to rejoin us in our next meeting. And with that, I hope you will all stay in good health and engage or continue engaging in multilateral discussions on multilateral trade. Sorry, it's a little bit late here in New Zealand. So thank you very much for participation, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks also for the invitation. Thanks.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much.